Hello, and welcome to the Capital Stewards podcast. Have you ever heard the phrase, the first generation builds the wealth, the second generation holds on to it, and the third generation blows it? Well, perhaps that's historically true, but I think it's becoming less true in today's world. In fact, our kids are more interested in preserving what their parents and grandparents built or left behind than ever before. But just because they want to make wise decisions doesn't mean that they will. So this is part two of our series on building multi-generational wealth. If you haven't listened to the first part yet from a couple of weeks ago, I encourage you to go back and start there. In part one, we talked about the foundational principles of actually building multi-generational wealth. The big idea there is that you have to shift your focus from growing your income to acquiring assets, businesses, real estate, investment portfolios, acquiring things that produce value without requiring your constant presence, right? We talked about building the wedge. That means you got to widen the gap between your income and your spending so that you've got more capital to deploy. We talked about debt and how that's a tool for acquiring assets. It's not a moral prerogative. And then we talked about the importance of diversification over time and critically patience. Real multi-generational wealth takes years to build, often decades. It's a long game. And I also talked about how it's for everyone. You don't have to have your name on a building or aspire to that to want to leave a legacy for your kids. You can leave, a small business, a medium-sized business, a really, really large business, all of those things. Can help accomplish the same goal and can springboard your family and set them up for generations to come. So today we're going to talk about what comes next, and that's maybe the harder question. Once you've started building something, how do you bring the people that you love along for the journey? How do you make sure that the next generation is ready to steward what you've worked so hard to build? And ultimately, how do you transfer it in a way that actually serves your family and your community for generations to come? So lots to unpack. Let's dive in. Let's start with the fear, because I think that's where a lot of people are living. The fear that building wealth, passing it to your kids is going to somehow backfire. You hear that saying all the time. The first generation makes the wealth, the second generation protects it or preserves it, the third generation spends it or they blow it. And there's a reason that that saying exists. It's happened in a lot of families. I've seen it over the course of my career working with wealthy families. But what's interesting today, though, is that the pattern I think is less true today than it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And it's less true because families are being more intentional. Research from RBC, which is a Royal Bank of Canada, found that more than 80% of people between 25 and 30, 25 and 35 or 34, I think in the survey, feel a genuine sense of responsibility for preserving their family's wealth. 80%. That's not a generation sitting around waiting on their inheritance, trying to buy things and be spendthrifts. They want to be engaged. They want to understand. They want to carry that past vision forward, and they just need to be taught how to do it. And that's the key. They need to be taught. That's everything. Because here's the thing, families who end up with spoiled or unprepared kids aren't the ones that talked about money with them. They're the ones who didn't. Secrecy does not prevent entitlement. It just prevents preparation. And those are very different problems. So what does intentional preparation look like? And maybe to start with, what it looks like, we'll start with what it's not, because I think this will be relatable. The most common approach that I've seen, and this has been, the thing since I've been in this business for 20 years. You gather everyone, you have that annual family meeting. You look at the financials or talk about where some charitable dollars are going. Everybody has a nice dinner, and then you all go home. And that is better than nothing. And I'll give credit where it's due for that. But what do you actually learn from sitting in a meeting once a year? Think about your own professional life, how you built your business. When you hire someone for an important role, how long does it take to actually train them? Months, sometimes over a year. And that's for a job, not for an entire financial legacy. Stewarding multi-generational wealth is one of the most complex things a family can do. You cannot train someone to do that in an annual meeting that they're going to sit in 5 or 6 times before you're gone. It takes active, ongoing involvement over years, and sometimes even decades. So if the annual meeting isn't enough, what does real engagement look like? I like to think about that in 3 areas. The first is involving the next generation in real business decisions. And I mean that literally, not a simulation, not a school project, but actual decisions that your business or your investments are facing. Even high school age kids can contribute meaningfully if you invite them to do that. Should you move your office to a different location? Is your current marketing approach reaching the younger customers that you need? What do you think is missing in this community that people actually want? How do we make the company more attractive to entry-level employees? And here's the thing, younger family members often have genuinely useful answers to those questions because they're the demographic that you're trying to reach. They're living in your community and they see things that you don't see. So you're not doing it just to educate them. You might actually get some real insights along the way. You're genuinely inviting their perspective. And sometimes the answer is going to actually change something about how you think about your business or how your business performs. And that's powerful for them and for the business. And remember, too, it's not just like business 101 to learn. You need to teach them the why behind what you're doing, not just the P and L, right? What's the purpose, right? You can teach someone accounting, they can go to school and get a degree, right? You can teach someone how to read balance sheets, explain diversification strategies, but the why that you're in the business that you're in, what do you believe your assets are for? What impact do you want your family to have in the world and your community? That's not on a spreadsheet. That's transmitted through conversation and example over years. Questions like, why are you in a particular business? What problem does it solve? How does it make people's lives better? How is your business doing good in your community? Does your firm make the community stronger? What does the financial flexibility that your business provides allow your family to do that you couldn't otherwise do, right? You may have perspective on that because maybe that happened earlier in your life and they haven't necessarily seen that as much recently, right? They just felt the flexibility. They haven't felt the other side of that. And then ultimately, what would you do with the wealth if you could do anything at all, right? Those are questions that have answers that go way beyond the numbers. And when your children and grandchildren start to understand those answers, and when they share them, they're far more likely to carry your mission forward like you would want them to. And the most important thing about this is that they need to be with you to learn this, not somewhere else, right? They have to, it's on the job training. They're going to be with you day after day, meeting after meeting to do that. So think on the job training. The second area that you can engage folks in is charitable engagement. And this one, I think, is often underestimated. A lot of families do give generously. They make donations, they support causes they care about, they're philanthropically active, but they do it sort of at their kids rather than with their kids. The check writing happens, the younger generation hears about it, maybe they go to a party or something, they don't experience it. It's different knowing, there's a difference between knowing that giving matters and feeling the gifting and the impact that it's having on the community. When a family goes together to volunteer in an organization that they support, right? When they watch people's lives actually change because of what your family has given monetarily, that does something different. It builds a relationship with generosity that's rooted in those experiences, not in just sort of an obligation to write some checks. And that relationship with giving is one of the most powerful antidotes to entitlement, frankly, that I know, because they see what wealth actually makes possible when it's used well. It gives them this positive framing and it gives them some perspective on, what they can do with all that they've been given, right? Wealth starts to feel like a tool for impact in those cases rather than sort of a status symbol. And I think that reframe matters enormously to the next generation. They start to think about relationships, stewardship, and impact instead of more traditional sort of money, fame, power stuff type goals, right? The third area is financial transparency. Bringing them into the room with your advisors, your investment advisor, your estate attorney, your CPA, let them sit in on those meetings, let them hear the conversations, ask questions, understand how decisions are made. I know some parents push back on this because they're worried about revealing how much they have. They think it will change their kids if they know the numbers. And I understand that fear. I get that. We have kids ourselves, and I don't, I don't want them to be, persuaded one way or the other based on our finances. But here's what I found. By the time your kids are in their 20s, they have a pretty good intuition about your family's level of wealth anyway. They've been watching you make decisions your whole life. They've been living in your house with your stuff. They've been in the world in high school and college. The precise numbers might be new information, but the general picture is not going to be a surprise to them. And more importantly, withholding that information, like I said, it doesn't prevent entitlement. It just prevents preparation, like I said earlier. I think the families that open the books thoughtfully at the right time in the context of real conversations about values and purpose consistently report that their children become more engaged, more responsible, more genuinely invested in what's been built, not less. So engage your family members in real business decision making, real charitable giving, and consider providing real financial transparency earlier rather than later. Those are the key parts of sort of that active engagement process to raise stewards, all right, to raise people who are going to steward wealth well. It's an on-the-job experience. It's not something you learn in a classroom. It's not something you learn in a meeting a couple of times. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the technical side, because I think there's a lot of confusion around estate planning and wealth transfer. And I think a lot of people have a very specific image of what estate planning means. Death and taxes. You sit in a lawyer's office, you sign some documents, and you're done. And that's almost the exact opposite of what effective estate planning actually is. So let me offer like a little bit of a different framing. Estate planning done right is not primarily about what happens when you die. It's about building a springboard for the next generation over the course of your entire life. Like we've been talking about, it's on the job training. It starts when your kids are young. It evolves as your wealth grows. And the legal documents are like the last 10% of the work, not the whole thing. One other thing maybe up front here is this isn't just for people that have taxable estates. Wealth transfer strategies are important for people with regular IRAs and maybe rental properties they're going to sell, 401ks, other assets. It really doesn't matter how much money you have. The overarching goals are the same. The techniques just vary depending on your specific situation. So like I mentioned now a few times, hopefully you're getting the idea that it starts with giving kids real financial decisions to make as early as as possible. Even little ones, right? An allowance requires you to make actual choices. A summer job, whether it's in the family business or somewhere else in the community, those are really powerful early learning opportunities, and require kids to make hard decisions about earning money and then how they're going to allocate those resources, how they're going to spend it. One of the most powerful earning opportunities, one of the most powerful early learning opportunities, and one that maybe is like underutilized a little bit is college planning. And so maybe if we thought about college planning a little bit differently, there'd be more we could sort of learn from the process. So think about this. If you fund a 529 college savings plan for your children or one of your kids, and then you share the details about what's in it with them, you let them know what resources are available, and then let them make decisions about where to go to school and how to use those resources within that budget. Let them figure out scholarships. Let them decide whether that prestigious school is private school is worth spending more on, or whether a less expensive option leaves them in a stronger financial position. So instead of just writing a blank check for whatever college they choose, you're giving them a budget and asking them to steward those resources. The incentives there are real, right? Here's where it kind of gets interesting talking about technical things, right? Under the current rules, unused 529 funds can be rolled over into a Roth IRA. There are some limits and some complexity to how that works, but the basic concept is a student who's thoughtful about their college spending might graduate with money left in that 529 plan, and that becomes the beginning of their sort of retirement savings, or savings that they can tap into later on in life. And so there's real incentive with real long-term consequences. I mean, it teaches, I think, exactly the right lesson, which is the resources your family have, they've been given to you to be stewarded, not just spent. And for families that are really thinking sort of across multi-generations, since we're talking about 529 plans, you can overfund a 529 plan intentionally. Beneficiaries can be changed. You can build what's essentially a family education endowment that pays for college costs for your kids, for your grandkids, great-grandchildren, and beyond. There's no required distributions in 529s. You're just sort of rolling the beneficiary down to the next person in line, so to speak. But the key is making sure that each student has a real budget, even if you do superfund a 529, so it's got lots of money in it. Make sure each student has a real budget, and then they're held accountable to it. And that's a completely different way to think about college planning than I think what a lot of folks do today. Let's talk about the bigger picture of estate planning for a minute. The single most important mind shift here, I think, is understanding that estate planning is not a one-time event. Again, hopefully you're getting the common theme. It's an ongoing process that unfolds over decades. The reason that training the next generation is so critical is that effective estate planning a lot of times starts with transferring significant assets to your kids when they're in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s, long before you're actually gone. And they need to be ready for that. The document part of it just comes at the end, not at the beginning, right? The documents formalize decisions that relationships and training have already set up over time. So let's talk about some of those kind of document, maybe driven tools or technical things that you can do. The most accessible one, and one that applies to almost everybody, is annual exclusion gifting, right? Under current rules, a married couple can give about $38,000 per year to each child and grandchild without triggering a gift tax or touching their sort of lifetime estate exemption and getting into more complicated things. That doesn't sound like a lot on its own, but if you run that math over time, if you have two children and you start this in your early 50s, by the time you're in your mid 70s, you've transferred well over $1 million to each child tax-free, not counting any growth on those gifts once they're in your kids' hands, right? So that's actually many millions of dollars probably out of your estate. Add grandchildren into the equation and the numbers grow even more dramatically. So it's the consistency over time and starting early that makes that powerful. Let's talk about some more complex techniques: trusts, estates, family partnerships, those kinds of things. They serve two purposes. I think people miss this sometimes. First, they can help reduce estate tax liability for families with larger estates, and that's generally, where these conversations start is around estate taxes. But second, and maybe more practically, a lot of times they provide a structure for managing assets that are hard to divide. Family business, portfolio of real estate. If you have three kids and one big piece of commercial property, you can't divide the building, right? But you can create a family partnership or a trust that holds the building, distributes the partnership interest to each child, et cetera. And it helps solve the kind of structural problems. And by the way, all of these strategies need to be set up, like our theme so far, well in advance, years in advance. Many of the most effective estate tax strategies have annual limits, and they need time to build and be really valuable in the estate planning process. So this is, again, why starting early matters. The families that sit down with an estate planning attorney in their 70s and do their estate planning, they've left significant value on the table compared to families that start the process in their 40s and their 50s. So let's get into some specific tax strategies, because I think that's where people's eyes glaze over a little bit too, but that's probably where there's some real value. So there's two in particular that come up all the time for families with significant assets. And I think they're worth understanding at a conceptual level, even if the specifics kind of require working with somebody who's a professional and has a lot of expertise. The first is that life insurance can be used as an estate planning tool. And I want to be clear, if you listen to lots of episodes of this show, I'm generally not a fan of permanent life insurance as an investment vehicle. It's frequently sold as one, and in most cases, it is not a good investment. But there is one specific situation where whole life or universal life insurance is genuinely useful, and that's in estate planning. When it's properly structured, that's usually through what's called an irrevocable life insurance trust or an ILIT, the death benefit is not included in your taxable estate. That means you can pay the premiums from your estate taxable assets over time, and the payout at death transfers to your heirs completely free of estate tax. So for families that would have otherwise faced an estate tax bill, this can be a meaningful way to preserve wealth in that transfer. And the details really, really matter here. So if this sounds relevant for you, you want to work with an experienced estate planning attorney. And I find this particularly useful kind of at the bottom end of the estate tax threshold. So that's $15 million per person and $30 million for couples. So if you don't have assets above that, you're not paying estate taxes. So you probably don't need permanent life insurance. But if you do have assets right above that, and say your taxable estate's $35 million, a small insurance policy might wipe out most of that estate tax liability without the need for more complicated and expensive sort of trusts to get created and things like that. All right, and then the second strategy that I think can apply across the board to a lot of people, this is true regardless of whether you're actually estate taxable or not, just to anyone that holds assets, is called the step up in cost basis. This is one of the most powerful and least discussed tools in all of estate planning because no lawyers are required. Let me explain kind of how it works with a story. So imagine you bought a piece of real estate 30 years ago for $500,000, $500,000 piece of real estate. Today it's worth $3 million. If you sell that property while you're alive, you owe capital gains tax on the $2.5 million of appreciation. At current long-term capital gains rates, you could easily be writing a check to the government that's $500,000 or more. It's more money than you actually paid for the property. That's $500,000 that's gone, right? But there is an alternative. Instead of selling, if you hold that property and it passes to your heirs when you die, they receive it with a new cost basis that's equal to the current market value. So that's $3 million. And then if they turn around and sell it immediately after, their capital gain is essentially zero. They owe almost nothing in tax. So that embedded gain is wiped out in death. That's what's called a step up in cost basis. That's what that means. And the cost basis goes from $500,000 to the current market value of $3 million. Your heirs are treated as if they bought it at today's price. And the implication for multi-generational families is really significant, because if you've got a lot of high quality assets that you intend to pass on anyway, there's often a strong tax argument for just holding on to those things rather than selling them during your lifetime. And you might ask, is there a downside? Of course, there's a downside to everything, right? You might need liquidity. If those assets aren't performing well and you need to exit them or sell them, that's obviously, means you're going to have to take the gains. You might need to sell some to diversify, right? So you might want to sell some and then hold on to some. So you always have to look at the full picture, right? But as one factor in the decision, that step up in basis is really powerful. And it's often kind of underappreciated. Let's talk about charitable giving. I think there's this perception that having a foundation or a giving structure is only for people that give at a certain level. And that's one myth that I want to dispel. You don't need to be a Gates or a Rockefeller to have a structured approach to charitable giving. The tool that I recommend for a lot of families is something called a donor advised fund. A donor advised fund is basically a charitable giving account that's held within a larger sponsoring organization. Sometimes that's called a community foundation, but you can also set these up a lot of times at major brokerage firms like Schwab or Fidelity. You contribute assets to the fund, you get an immediate charitable deduction, and then over time, you recommend grants from the fund to whatever causes or nonprofits you care about. And then that sponsoring organization handles all the administrative burden, tax filings, compliance, lots of things like that. So it's like having your own family foundation without actually having to run a foundation. You get the same tax benefits, the same control over where the money goes without all the overhead. And you can start one with a pretty modest initial contribution, sometimes just a few $1,000s. Over time, it can grow substantially as you add to it and the assets appreciate. And also importantly, you can involve the next generation in giving decisions, which is one of my favorite features, right? You can bring your children and grandchildren into the grant making decision process. They're actively participating in your generosity, building their own relationship with philanthropy, like we talked about earlier, understanding how wealth can be used to create impact. It ties back directly to everything that we talked about earlier regarding engaging the next generation. So, and then the last point on today's podcast, multi-generational families should think about their investments differently, different from a standard retirement savings framework. And this is a point I feel really strongly about, because I think a lot of families that have multi-generational wealth aspirations are getting investment advice that's designed for a completely different goal. The overwhelming majority of investment advice that's out there, what you see in the media, what most financial advisors provide, what target date funds are built around, is designed for individuals that are saving for their own retirement. The logic is you take more risk when you're young and you gradually shift towards safer assets as you age, and you plan to spend it down over a 25 to 30-year window. And that's sensible advice if your goal is your own retirement. But that's not the goal if you're building multi-generational wealth. You have a different set of goals, and so you need a different approach. If you're trying to build a financial foundation that sustains your family for 50 or 100 years, your time horizon is very different. You're not trying to fund your retirement. You're trying to keep a financial engine running across multiple generations while enabling generosity and growth along the way. And the goal is more similar to like a university endowment than it is to a personal retirement account. So endowments maintain higher allocation to equities, more stocks, more alternative assets, even as they are distributing funds every year, because their time horizon is essentially perpetual. They don't intend to spend down their assets. They're not trying to preserve capital in the narrow sense. They're trying to preserve purchasing power and growth capacity over decades, right? So for multi-generational families, this likely means maintaining higher allocations to stocks, business equity, less bonds, and particularly more equity and fewer bonds than like the conventional wisdom or rules of thumb would suggest, even as you age and get into your 60s and 70s and beyond. So if your assets are meant to serve your children and their children, the relevant time horizon might be 50 or 75 years, not a typical 30-year retirement horizon. So over that time frame, equities and businesses almost always outperform bonds and cash, matching your investment strategy to your actual goals, not the goals of sort of the average retirement saver. So this is one of the most important decisions I think that a multi-generational family can make. Make sure that your investment goals match what your life goals are, what you're trying to do, not just sort of what someone said is a good idea for someone who's 60 or 70 years old. All right, so let's synthesize everything we've talked about in this series on multi-generational wealth down. So I'd say there are three phases to think about. The first phase is building, shifting from income to assets, widening the wedge, using debt strategically. You're starting with businesses and real estate, and then you're diversifying as you go, and you're going to give it time, a lot of time for it to grow, right? The second phase is stewarding, and that happens concurrently with building, right? Once you get over that initial plateau, once you build something, you want to engage the next generation early and often in real decisions. You want to build a culture of generosity together, not you building it, but you want to build it together. You want to open the books up thoughtfully, teach them not just what your finances, sort of what the numbers are, but the why behind them. Help them understand the purpose behind everything that you've built, because the purpose is what gets carried forward when you're not there to carry it yourself. And then the third phase is transferring. The third phase is transfer. And that's understand that estate planning is not a single meeting. It's a decades-long process. You want to start early, give kids real financial decisions to make when they're young. We talked about using 529 plans and wealth transfer tools. maybe in that process. You want to be consistent with annual gifting. Explore structures like trusts and family partnerships when that stuff's appropriate. Be thoughtful about when to sell those high appreciation assets. Hold on for the step up in basis, if that makes sense. We talked about donor advised funds and using those to structure giving sort of efficiently and bringing the next generation into the fold again there as well. So, and then lastly, you want to invest like an endowment, invest like a multi-generational family, not like a retirement saver. So that's the complete framework. And honestly, it's not primarily a financial conversation. It's really a family goals conversation. That's the deepest truth, I think, in all of this. The families that do this well aren't primarily the ones with the best tax strategies or the most sophisticated investment portfolios. They're the ones with clear values, really strong relationships, and a shared sense of purpose that spans across generations. So the financial tools serve that mission, they don't create it. So if any of this sparked questions about your own family's wealth journey, I really encourage you to reach out. Happy to have a more in-depth conversation. The full blog on these podcast episodes is available at thecapitalstewards.com. And there are 3 detailed articles covering everything we've talked about on this couple of episodes. So if you're ready to have a real conversation with us, there's a start a conversation button right at the top of the homepage, and you can schedule a call. Tell us a little bit about why you're here and where you want to go. And we would be happy to help you figure out for the right fit to help you get where you're trying to go. So with that, I will see you on the next episode of the Capital Stewards podcast.